This is BBC Radio 4. Now, bailout boys go to Dublin. Dan O'Brien, the economics editor of the Irish Times, tells the inside story of Ireland's multi-billion-pound bailout.
In November last year, Ireland went through some of the most tumultuous days in its recent history. The country's crippled economy became the subject of world attention. In the space of just 2 weeks and 2 days, it suffered a severe loss of economic sovereignty and joined a growing number of countries in Europe's bailout club. This is a story of high drama, international diplomacy and ultimately political meltdown.
I had fought for 2.5 years to avoid this, and now hell was at the gates.
The Irish Finance Minister Brian Lenihan knew the stakes couldn't have been higher. His country's future and his reputation hung in the balance.
I have a very vivid memory of going to Brussels on the final Monday to sign the agreement and being on my own at the airport, looking at the snow gradually thawing and thinking to myself, this is terrible. No Irish minister has ever had to do this before.
It was an extraordinary couple of weeks for Ireland. It started with the Irish government insisting it didn't need any help from outside and ended with an €85 billion international bailout.
There was a feeling of complete humiliation, that we had been brought low through hubris. The Celtic Tiger suddenly, totally collapsed.
The atmosphere was one of bewilderment. People felt they were being lied to. Politically, it was a game changer in Irish politics.
It was a sense of, my God, what have we done? What has happened here that we've ended up in this situation? It was a horrendous time to be in government.
For years, Ireland had been seen as a model economy. Its boom had been spectacular and looked as if it would go on forever. But for much of the boom, trouble had been brewing. By 2007, an enormous property bubble had stopped growing. When the international financial crisis happened in 2008, that bubble exploded, sending Ireland's economy into freefall and blowing a hole in the foundations of the country's banks. Vast sums were pumped into the banks by both the Irish government and the European Central Bank. But by the autumn of last year, deposits were flowing out of those banks at an alarming and unsustainable rate. This is the inside story of the 2 weeks of talks in November, the frenzied behind-the-scenes negotiations, the anguish of a government desperately trying to hold on to its economic sovereignty, and the intense pressure put on Ireland by Europe.
RTE News at 1 on Radio 1, this is Sean O'Rourke.
On Friday, the 12th of November, Ireland became the centre of feverish speculation. The Bloomberg news agency gave the clearest indication of what was happening. It said Ireland was being urged by European policymakers to take emergency aid to contain a debt crisis rattling their markets. The story flashed across the world. That weekend, Brian Cowan, the Irish Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, led the denials that anything was afoot.
We've made no application whatever for funding. We have funding up to mid-year.
Good evening and welcome to the Weekend Politics. For days now, the air has been thick with speculation, rumour and denial.
As speculation intensified that Ireland was on the verge of applying for a bailout, one government minister after another came out to say that nothing was happening. They maintained that the country had enough money in its coffers to last until the middle of 2011 and didn't want or need any outside help. The Justice Minister, Dermot Ahern, on RTE television on Sunday evening was emphatic.
Minister, where is all this speculation coming from? Is it just total fiction?
It is fiction. There are no negotiations going on. If there were, obviously government would be aware of it, and we are not aware of it. I spoke to the Taoiseach this morning, I spoke with the Minister for Finance, and absolutely nothing is taking place in this respect.
But something was going on.
The European authorities had clearly decided that they'd had enough.
Carl Whelan is Professor of Economics at University College Dublin and had contacts with the negotiating teams. He believes that the European Central Bank, which had already lent Irish banks massive amounts of money, was running out of patience.
The total sum of those borrowings was up to 130 billion. Now that's an enormous figure. The Irish GDP is about 160 billion. And the European Central Bank saw this as a problem that wasn't getting any better. Officially, the Irish government had to request that funds from Europe be made available to help them out. They didn't want to make that request, but it's fair to say that pressure was put on over that weekend.
Finance Minister Brian Lennon has told us, in fact, that he had received a letter from Jean-Claude Trichet, the President of the European Central Bank, on the Friday, and so before those government denials. In it, he says the ECB spelt out its concerns about the amount of money it was owed by Irish banks and suggested that the country should be looking at applying for a bailout.
Mr. Trichet wrote to me. He raised the question about whether Ireland would be participating in a programme at that stage. I rang Mr. Trichet after receipt of the letter, but it was clear to me that there was a serious issue for Ireland. And I said it was important we discuss his concerns, and we agreed that on the following Sunday there would be an official level discussion about these issues in Brussels.
Around that time, your cabinet colleagues famously and very emphatically said there was absolutely nothing happening.
Yeah.
And that caused outrage. There was real sense of anger.
I was in very difficult negotiations. We were simply having exploratory official discussions, and I didn't think that would be the appropriate time to alert the public generally as to the fact we were having such discussions. I'd have weakened our diplomatic hand in that regard.
But the Irish people felt they had a right to know and were getting increasingly frustrated. They felt at best they weren't being given the whole truth. At worst, they were being lied to. And across Europe, there was anger for different reasons. Other European governments started to talk of contagion, even a collapse of the euro if Ireland didn't accept a bailout. On Tuesday, Brian Lennon travelled to Brussels for a meeting of European finance ministers. Ireland was top of the agenda. Germany's Deputy Finance Minister, Jörg Asmussen, was there.
I remember well that meeting. It was made very clear to the Irish Finance Minister that it is not just about Ireland. It was made very clear that his decision has an influence on the economic well-being of other parts of the Eurozone. The functioning of the currency union was at stake.
We have been told by several sources that the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, wanted Brian Lennon to go out from that meeting and announce that Ireland was accepting a bailout, and that he refused. Brian Lennon says this is exactly what happened.
The German minister did not approve of the fact that I hadn't authority from my government to enter the programme, and he said, "You must join the press conference." And I refused and said I wouldn't participate on that basis, that my government had a sovereign right to decide how it conducted these discussions.
Tonight, the Chancellor says Britain stands ready to support Ireland to ensure the stability of its banking system.
George Osborne was also at the Brussels meeting. By now, it was being suggested that a bailout could be backed by billions of pounds of British taxpayers' money.
We're going to do what is in Britain's national interests. Ireland is our closest neighbour, and it's in Britain's national interest that the Irish economy is successful and we have a stable banking system. So Britain stands ready to support Ireland in the steps that it needs to take to bring about that stability. And now I'm going to go into the meeting. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It's 7 o'clock on Thursday, the 18th of November. On RTÉ Radio 1, this is Morning Ireland with Rachel English and Colin McCullough.
On Thursday morning, the head of the Irish Central Bank, Patrick Honohan, did an extraordinary thing. He called the state broadcaster RTE and asked to go on air. After days of confusion and government denials, the central bank governor did an interview in which he told the Irish people exactly what was happening.
The intention is and the expectation is on their part and personally on my part that a loan will be made available and drawn down as necessary. We're talking about a very substantial loan, tens of billions for sure.
Suddenly, everything was out in the open. The nation had been waiting for the government to tell them what was going on. But no one had expected it to happen quite like this. I asked Patrick Honohan about his highly unusual interview.
On the morning of the 18th of November, the Irish nation woke up to hear you speaking on the most listened to radio programme from Frankfurt.
Yes, I do apologise for that. It's a nightmare to have the central bank governor wake you up on the radio, but they were...
This was quite, apart from possibly being a nightmare, it was a surprise for many people. How did that come about? Why did you do that?
A friend texted me around midnight the night before, said, look, there's an article in the Financial Times, a leader in the Financial Times saying, effectively, people should be planning on bank runs. And I thought, well, here's a situation where there seems to be considerable public anxiety about what's happening in the financial sector in Ireland. I know what's happening.
I better get the message out there.
Did you discuss, before you went on that show, did you discuss with either the finance minister or the prime minister of the country, the Taoiseach?
No. I operate an independent role here. It was an idea that came to me overnight. Anyway, look, I had no desire to wrong foot anybody, and not in any way trying to influence what government ministers would do or say.
But the Irish Prime Minister could barely disguise his anger. In the Dáil, Brian Cowan said tersely, "The Governor has given his view." The government had been totally wrong-footed. In his interview, Patrick Honohan also revealed that teams from the European Commission, the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund were already in Ireland and would be having talks that morning. We now know that within an hour of the Governor's interview, the teams were sitting down at the Irish Central Bank for their first meeting. Patrick Honohan recalls those early meetings.
There was a very large team, just crowds of people not knowing where they were really going, sitting around. The floor here was more heavily populated than ever before. People all wanting to be in the inner sanctum of the top-level group. There was, I think, a very much a shared understanding of the problems, some points at which there are disagreements on what's the best way forward.
Would you care to elaborate on the differences?
Of course not.
AJ Chopra was one of the newly arrived visitors in Dublin. He led the IMF delegation.
What we were trying to do was to avoid a situation where you had a full-fledged bank run. The banks were already in cardiac arrest, so we all had the common purpose of making sure that what was already a difficult situation did not become totally chaotic.
The financial stability of Ireland and Europe was threatened. The discussions were billed as a short, focused consultation, and the IMF was very keen to stress this. Events were moving fast.
We were prepared for pretty much any eventuality at that point.
AJ Chopra quickly became a household name in Dublin. Tabloid newspapers joked about whether the IMF had come to Dublin to do their Christmas shopping. He became the public face of the so-called Troika, the three organisations involved in the bailout: the IMF, the European Commission and the European Central Bank. The three have always portrayed, and still do, an image of a united front. But according to Brian Lenihan, the three often had very different approaches.
The Commission's view was considerably more relaxed than that of the ECB. The Commission felt that Ireland should be given a chance to see whether it can survive, and the ECB clearly subscribed to a different view. The hope was that Ireland could be kept out of a bailout, and the European Central Bank appeared to have arrived at a view at Governing Council level that Ireland needed to be totally nailed down.
The day after the central banker's interview, the embattled Irish Prime Minister confirmed for the first time that talks on a bailout were underway. Here in the Irish Parliament there was fury. Accusations of a government cover-up and economic treason were the order of the day. The economic crisis had become a political crisis. And the governing Fianna Fáil party, which had ruled Ireland for 60 of the past 78 years, was under attack like never before. Having traditionally portrayed itself as the great defender of the Irish Republic, it now stood accused of betraying that republic and handing away its sovereignty.
I can say that we were extremely concerned about what was happening.
Sean Connick was a junior minister in the government.
When the announcement was made, I felt very disappointed over the whole thing, disillusioned over the whole scenario. I genuinely didn't sleep for about 4 nights.
And what sort of impact was it? A sense of failure, a sense of shame, a sense of shock?
All of those. It was a sense of, my God, what have we done? What has happened here, that we've ended up in this situation? How could we not have foreseen this and prevented it?
On Sunday the 21st, the Irish government formally asked for help. Over the next few days, intense talks continued. We've been told that meetings often went on until 2 a.m. Some of the foreign officials barely slept. Once meetings with their Irish counterparts ended, no matter how late, they had to report back to their respective HQs in Brussels, Frankfurt and Washington. Amadeo Tardio was the chief spokesman for the European Commissioner, Olli Rehn.
We had meetings in all possible formats, video conferences, teleconferences at the Euro area level, at EU level, G7. It was very important to keep informed also our partners in the G20, the US, our colleagues in Canada and beyond. The phone diplomacy, I would say, was at the highest level. At that time, we were working from Monday to Sunday. We were aware of the urgency.
In Germany, the government was under pressure too. Jörg Asmussen, Germany's deputy finance minister, says history was weighing heavily on his government's involvement in the talks.
For historic reasons, Germany had a very strong attachment to the Deutschmark. We replaced it by the euro, and we promised to our citizens that the euro would be as stable as the Deutschmark was. The impression here in Germany was that in the currency zone you need to show solidarity.
And in the view of some of the officials, Ireland was not showing enough solidarity. Klaus Massou is head of the ECB mission.
People in Ireland are not aware about the huge support which they currently get from the ECB, from the Euro system. This is a privilege, but for this privilege, of course, the partners in the Eurozone also expect that every government, every country is doing its own homework, and this means keeping public finances stable and keeping, of course, also the banking sector stable.
As the talks continued, one major sticking point could not be overcome: corporation tax, the tax governments levy on company profits. Germany and France, the Eurozone's two biggest powers, had long resented what they perceived as Ireland's poaching of foreign investment with its low corporation tax rate. German finance spokesman Jörg Asmussen again.
The Irish authorities made extremely clear, to put it like this, that the corporate taxation rate was untouchable to them.
How aggravating was that for the German government?
That was an issue. I mean, the general feeling here among many Germans was that if you need financial assistance from abroad, you cannot keep your corporate taxation rate at the lowest rate of the European Union. But it was not easy to explain here in Parliament, and I know this is also true for the French Parliament.
The formal application for a bailout also had profound implications for domestic politics. On the Monday, a fatal blow was delivered to the coalition government. The Green Party, the junior partner, said that the time had come to call an election. They had spent the weekend planning an exit strategy. Eamon Ryan was a Green Party minister.
We met that weekend and we just had a very strong sense that the introduction of the IMF needed an election. It required us to have an election. That was just that moment in time we said, no, this is not tenable for this government just to continue as if nothing had happened, as if this isn't a game changer. For us it was. While that was a very difficult day, it was very difficult obviously in government with our colleagues.
For the Irish government, the game was up. The Prime Minister held a press conference to announce that there would be an election in the new year.
The Irish government seems a dead man walking. Soon after 7 tonight, it announced it'll dissolve itself as soon as it's tried to sign into law the austerity measures necessary to get its hands on bailout money.
The political instability horrified Europe. The European Commissioner for Economic Affairs, Olli Rehn, said he wanted to stop the bushfire in Ireland from turning into a European forest fire. On the Thursday, the Irish government published its 4-year austerity plan. It involved massive cuts to public spending, reductions in welfare, and the cutting of the minimum wage. On Saturday, tens of thousands of people gathered in Dublin to protest. Brian Lenihan was watching events closely.
Were you concerned that anger would spill over and there would be social unrest?
Of course, I was very concerned about this. And I was very concerned about this from the very start of this whole process. I believed that Europe was pressing so hard that there was a risk of provoking social unrest because they were pushing matters so hard. Well, I made that point very vigorously with the European authorities from September on.
Was it accepted?
It wasn't accepted, no. I was concerned it could go beyond that. And I thought that Europe was pushing matters where they could push people beyond a brink if they weren't careful.
On the evening of Sunday, the 28th of November, just 2 weeks after the crisis had started, Brian Cowan and other senior cabinet ministers filed into the main government press centre to announce, definitively and formally, that Ireland would be bailed out.
A programme of assistance for Ireland totalling €85 billion has been agreed. The estimated average interest rate of the loans is in the order of 5.83%. This programme is absolutely essential for the country.
What happened next, for me, symbolised this historic moment. The Irish government ministers left the room. Then the Bailout boys, as they'd become known, held their own press conference.
In the main government press centre, deep in the heart of Irish government buildings, the European Commission, the ECB and the IMF lined up to spell out the details of how the bailout would work. It was clear that Ireland was no longer in the driving seat of its own economy.
The €85 billion deal agreed on our behalf behind closed doors. So just who decides Ireland's economic future?
The deal had been done. It remained only for the technicalities to be worked out. David Norris, a prominent independent senator, says it was a difficult pill to swallow.
It was very sad, and it suggested that there was indeed an intellectual and political vacuum at the heart of the Irish establishment, because this was the government press centre, and this was taken over by representatives of agencies who had been called in to rescue the remains of the Celtic Tiger. So of course it was sad and it was poignant. And on a human level, one has to feel some degree of sadness for people like Brian Lenihan and Brian Cowan, because I do not believe that they set out to ruin this country.
Why did the Irish government acquiesce?
Well, that is a very interesting question. And I wonder if it's not because we are still deferential, that we still have not got out of the habit of being bullied.
Was Brian Lennon, was he bullied?
Well, I believe he must have been. I think the whole government were.
He was not the only person to have concerns. From the moment the terms of the package were outlined that evening, there was controversy. Many claimed the interest rate charged in the bailout funds was penal. Some said the package would scupper any chance of economic recovery. Michael Summers was a senior policymaker for decades.
Whether all these conditions will aid Ireland's recovery or not, I just don't know. This recipe to close budget deficit and pay extra interest, I'm not sure that this whole equation adds up.
But Patrick Honohan, the governor of the central bank, is less downbeat.
Perhaps Irish people expected, as we have got in the past from Europe, a handout. From my point of view, this is the absolute right and necessary thing to do. There is a couple of years of hard work ahead, and we now need to move forward and try to make sure that the longer term problems are resolved.
Even now, almost 6 months after the bailout, it's still not clear just how much pressure Ireland was put under. There's no doubt Europe was desperate to get Ireland into a bailout to protect the rest of the Eurozone. The suggestion that Ireland was forced into this, and in particular by the European Central Bank, won't go away. Klaus Massou of the ECB is very clear.
The Irish government decided on its own to seek help. We are not pushing, we are advising the government. It's important for the people to understand that the program is the consequence of bad policies in the past. This program does not cause further problems, it solves problems. We have not pushed anybody.
Brian Lenihan sees it rather differently.
Would it be fair to say then that the ECB bounced Ireland into a bailout?
It would be fair to say that the major force of pressure for a bailout came from the ECB. Yes, I would say that.
For Brian Lenihan, the bailout was a profound personal defeat.
I had fought for 2.5 years to avoid this conclusion, and now we were at it. As I said earlier, I saw that Ireland's financial survival was very much an issue from late 2008 on. I had had such a fierce struggle to bring my colleagues and the country with me on what had been a very difficult economic programme. I believed that I had fought the good fight and taken every measure possible to delay such an eventuality. And now hell was at the gates. And I have a very vivid memory of going to Brussels on the final Monday to sign the agreement and being on my own at the airport and looking at the snow gradually thawing and thinking to myself, this is terrible. No Irish minister has ever had to do this before. I know Dennis Healy had to do it in the United Kingdom in 1976, but it's not a good position to be in. It's not a good place to be at.
3 months after the bailout was finalised, Ireland went to the polls. The government was trounced. Although Brian Lenihan held his seat, his party suffered its worst ever election defeat, and not a single Green Party MP was re-elected. The bailout was a central issue in the election campaign. Two main opposition parties promised forcefully that they would renegotiate the terms of the bailout, including the interest rate Ireland was paying.
But when they took power, they faced immediate hostility from Europe to any suggestion that the terms would be changed after such a short period of time. So far, the new coalition's efforts to improve the terms have come to naught. And what are the prospects of any future improvement? Amedeo Tardio of the European Commission.
We think that it doesn't make much sense to support the country and at the same time putting such a high burden that when the country is in a better shape, they have to start repaying lots of money. It doesn't make much sense. And we are very hopeful that this approach will prevail in the coming weeks. The argument should be debt sustainability, supporting the debt sustainability of the country.
But it's not the Commission that really counts here. Those providing the funds call the shots. Germany and France are providing most of the money, and it appears that they are not for budging. Europe's unwillingness to offer concessions to the new government risks souring the traditionally strong pro-European attitude of Irish people. I asked Brian Lenihan if he thought the Irish could become more Eurosceptic.
I think that is a risk. Yes, I do think that is a risk of how this matter. And I haven't publicly said this before now because I was anxious to get out of my job as Minister for Finance, anxious to have a good election campaign here in Ireland. But I think Europe should realise that Europe is better working with an Irish government rather than seeking to move Irish governments on. I'm not sure that's a good idea.
I have to ask, at any point, did you feel betrayed?
It's always felt with the European Central Bank that they were giving the money on the one hand, but sort of saying on the other hand, well, we don't really like doing this. Whereas I think in terms of generating market confidence, it's better to say, look, we're doing this. We're going to stand behind Ireland. And that sometimes reassures markets instead of, engaging in a language of panic.
But Brussels is not blind to the risks of rising Euroscepticism. Commission spokesman Amedeo Tardio again.
I want to be very honest. We haven't, on the contrary. I think that some Irish citizens are sometimes upset and they perceive the European Union as a very severe referee that is imposing a sanction on the Irish taxpayer. I hope that with time and with lots of humble explanation, pedagogy, we can tell the Irish citizens that our support was meaningful, that there is a concern about the welfare of the Irish citizens behind our actions, and that it was very important to provide this support in order to clean up the banking sector, to put it at the service of the real economy, and to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.
But more immediately, is the bailout working? The answer to that, after almost 6 months, is a resounding no. It's not working for Ireland, and it's not working for Europe. There has been no restoration of market faith in Ireland, nor has it halted contagion to other parts of the Eurozone. Earlier this month, Portugal followed Ireland and Greece into the bailout club. The entire euro edifice remains fragile.
Bailout Boys Go to Dublin was presented by Dan O'Brien. The producer was Adele Armstrong.